Welcome back to the Messiah Beyond a Shadow of Doubt. I'm Don McCluskey, and we are moving quickly through the Spring Appointed Times. This lesson is part 2 of the Spring Appointed Times, and we're going to resume by exploring first fruits and the Feast of Weeks, also called Pentecost. Okay, so here's our timeline that we started in the previous lesson. We began with corralling the lamb on the 10th, Passover on the 14th, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread on the 15th. I should emphasize that corralling the lamb is not one of the appointed times, but it is an inseparable component of Passover. Soon after the people of Israel ate the Passover meal, they emerged from their homes and began the journey to Mount Sinai. So let's resume our study by turning to Leviticus 23, which is our launch chapter for the appointed times, and see what we can learn about first fruits. Verses 9 to 11 say, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, and say to them, When you come into the land that I give to you, and reap its harvest, you shall bring the sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest, and he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord, so that you may be accepted. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it." So let's clarify a couple terms before we begin. Notice that the Lord said they are going to bring the sheaf of first fruits of your harvest to the priest. Well, what is a sheaf? A sheaf is a cutting of the stalks and ears of grain that are bundled together. In this drawing, the priest is holding a sheaf of barley. Notice he is holding it up, waving it to the Lord, which is called a wave or an elevation offering, since a priest would literally wave it or raise it to the Lord, and the people would be accepted by doing so. Now let's look at a very important concept. What is meant by first fruits? I used to think that it was referring to a burdensome tithe that Moses required from the people. Kind of like, oh no, this is the first round of tithes and there will be more to come. But it actually has a very different meaning. As the people's grain was growing in the field, they were told to bring a portion to the Lord as first fruits, which is an acknowledgement that the Lord gave this produce to them. It acknowledges that He provided it and that it comes with an expectation that He will provide more of it to the person who brought it to the priest. So this is a good thing, a very good thing. It's like saying, Lord, here's a token of what you provided for me. Thank you. And thanks that you will be providing more to me throughout the season. Does that make sense? It's a beautiful gesture. It also keeps the people mindful that the Lord is the source of their well-being. Now, with this understanding of first fruits, let's see if we can fit this into our timeline. Notice that He did not give us a date for first fruits. He said, on the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. So we read that and we scratch our heads and ask, which Sabbath is He talking about? Is He referring to the first high Sabbath of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or to the weekly Sabbath that would occur during the 7-day feast? Well, if you're stumped, don't feel alone. It turns out that during the 1st century BC, a great debate raged between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the two predominant religious sects within Judaism. They couldn't agree about it either. And you're probably thinking, well, if the Jewish scholars couldn't resolve it over 2,000 years ago, then how are we supposed to figure it out? Well, I have good news for you. The answer is right before our eyes in the text of Leviticus 23. It turns out that the debate was more of a religious preference than an interpretation issue. Because of this, we can determine the correct answer with full confidence. Let's take a look. The Pharisees took the position that Leviticus 23 referred to the first high Sabbath during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which means that first fruits would always occur on Abib 16. The Sadducees took the position that Leviticus 23:11 referred to the weekly Sabbath during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which means that first fruits would always occur on a Sunday during the 7-day feast. But the key is found by studying the timing of the next appointed time, which is the Feast of Weeks, where the Lord said, "You shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath, from the day when you brought in the sheaf of the wave offering," which is first fruits. There shall be 7 complete Sabbaths. You shall count 50 days to the day after the seventh Sabbath. And that is the key. The only way the Feast of Weeks could consistently fall on the day after a Sabbath is if it is counted from the day after a Sabbath, which would place first fruits on a Sunday, the day after the weekly Sabbath. So this locks in the timing for first fruits. So it looks like the Sadducees were correct. Hey, give it up for the Sadducees. So you might be wondering what all this means. Is it really important? Or are we just spending too much time on little details? Well, let me assure you that details such as these will either crystallize or blur the image of the Messiah in the appointed times. Truth is found in details like these. So with this understanding of first fruits, let's return to the account of the Israelites leaving Egypt. Remember, on the evening of the 15th, the firstborn in every house that did not have the blood on the doorposts and lintels was killed. After this tragedy affected the firstborn of Egypt, Pharaoh, in fear and anger, called Moses and Aaron and told them to get out of Egypt. So the people emerged from their homes and their journey of affliction began, with the entire nation walking, possibly as many as 2 million people, along with their flocks and herds. It's interesting that the Lord commanded Moses to record their route and camping locations as they journeyed. The information is found in the 33rd chapter of the book of Numbers. So let's take a look at a map of Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula. Their destination was Mount Sinai, which is believed to be in the southern part of the Sinai Peninsula. And just so you know, the locations on this map are only approximations. The point is that there were 3 encampments. So I'm going to summarize their journey in number 33, 5-8 as follows. They journeyed from Ramses and camped in Succoth. Then they journeyed from Succoth and camped in Ethan. Then they journeyed from Ethan and they camped before Migdol and passed through the midst of the sea into the wilderness. It's funny how it casually says, and passed through the midst of the sea into the wilderness, with no fanfare or any other commentary. So let's take a look at these encampments on our timeline. The people left Ramses sometime after midnight on the 15th. Recall that the Talmud teaches that that was a Friday, so we'll note that on our timeline. Now, archaeologists estimate that the journey from Ramses to Succoth was about 15 miles, so it would be reasonable to assume that they could have made the trek in roughly 8 hours at a slow 2-mile-per-hour pace. So when did they camp? Well, if they left after midnight, their first encampment was probably sometime during the early daylight hours of the 15th. Then they resumed their journey, and their second encampment, or rest, was probably around evening, which was the beginning of the 16th. In other words, sometime after sundown. After this rest, their third encampment was probably in the daytime hours of the 16th. And it was at this third encampment that Pharaoh's army caught up with them. But recall that the pillar of fire moved and stood between Pharaoh's army and the Israelites, and they were able to escape through the corridor in the sea during the night. So let's briefly revisit the amazing account of the crossing of the sea. The story is recorded in the 14th chapter of the book of Exodus. I recommend that you read this entire chapter on your own to fill in the gaps of my version of the story. Briefly, the Israelites had journeyed from the nighttime of the 15th and were no doubt exhausted. But after they left Ramses, Pharaoh and his servants looked at each other and asked, "What have we done? Why did we let them go from serving us?" So Pharaoh called for his personal chariot and mustered the choice chariots of Egypt, followed by the other chariots and horsemen and his army. And they pursued Israel and caught up with them as they were camping beside the sea. And when the people saw Pharaoh and their impending doom bearing down on them, they cried out in fear. But Moses said, "Do not fear, for the Lord will fight for you." And before Pharaoh's army was able to roar into the mass of people, the angel of God and the pillar of cloud moved and stood between Pharaoh's army and the Israelites. And through the night it kept Pharaoh's army from attacking them. Then the Lord told Moses to lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, so Israel can pass through the middle of it. But as the Israelites made their way toward the other side of the sea, the pillar of fire moved from its place that separated the army from Israel. And then the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, just as he said he would. He short-circuited his ability to reason so that he ordered his chariots and horsemen, an entire army, to pursue Israel into the divided sea. Are you mad, Pharaoh? Obviously. Now notice the timing in verse 24. It says, "At the morning watch, the Lord looked down on the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud and brought the army of the Egyptians into confusion. He caused their chariot wheels to swerve, and he made them drive with difficulty. So the Egyptians cried out in fear that the Lord is fighting for them. Then the Lord told Moses, 'Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the waters may come back over the Egyptians.' And when Moses did so, the sea returned to its normal state at daybreak, while the Egyptians were charging right into it. And the waters covered the chariots, the horsemen, and Pharaoh's entire army, and not even one of them survived. But Israel walked on dry land through the midst of the sea, and the waters were like a wall to them on the right and on their left." Okay, did you notice the timing? It says, "At the morning watch." And according to verse 27, all Israel was safely on the other side at daybreak. These two statements are very important since they have prophetic implications about the Messiah. Now, do you remember from the Tracking Time in Israel lesson that the morning watch was the last watch of the night that ended with sunrise? In other words, Moses collapsed the walls of the sea on top of the Egyptian army right before dawn. And at daybreak, Israel was safe and alive on the other side. So let's put this on our timeline. Their exodus began at midnight on Friday. They camped 3 times. Then, in the nighttime of the 17th, they passed through the corridor of the sea to the other side. And at daybreak, all Israel was safe on the other side. Moses brought the sea back together, completely destroying Pharaoh and his army. Now recall that their journey began on Friday, the 15th, as the Talmud states. They journeyed on Friday, Saturday, and rose from the sea at daybreak on Sunday, the first day of the week. And do you recall what day that is? The Sunday during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It's first fruits. So I think we can confidently say that first fruits commemorates Israel rising from the sea. Even so, the first fruits appointed time casts a shadow of something far greater, a shadow of another divinely powerful event in the life of the Messiah some 1,500 years later. On the 3rd day, the Israelites rose alive from the sea at daybreak on first fruits. So Jesus, on the 3rd day, rose alive from the grave at daybreak on first fruits. Now let's review our timeline to see how the time signature of the Messiah is shaping up. I left some key dates on the timeline to help you, so let's review it together. On the 10th of the month, they corralled the lamb. The 14th is Passover, and they killed the lamb at twilight. When the sun went down, the date became the 15th, and they ate the roasted lamb with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. The week-long feast of unleavened bread began on the 15th and continued through the 21st, commemorated this meal and the journey of affliction. Remember, the first and the last days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread were high Sabbaths. Then on the Sunday, during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, was first fruits. Of course, Sunday could have fallen at any point during the week of unleavened bread, since it was not a calendar date. But as we've seen, it fell on the 17th during the year of the Exodus, based on the Talmud's teaching that the 15th was a Friday. So this is our timeline of the spring appointed times as it stands to this point. It's pretty simple, but as I've said, the only thing that makes it a little bit tricky is that first fruits falls on a Sunday rather than the calendar date as our Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. and that is the appointed time that we call first fruits. Now we have one more spring appointed time to add to our timeline, which foreshadows another very important messianic event. It is the Feast of Weeks, which is also known as Pentecost. But I would like to make a couple points about the Feast of Weeks before we explore its timing. It is this day, and Jewish tradition agrees, on which the Lord gave the 10 Commandments, an event that is certainly worthy of being marked by a high Sabbath appointed time. But of far greater importance is the event that is shadowed by this holy day, a shadow of the Messiah, which we will explore when we investigate Christ in the spring appointed times in an upcoming lesson. So let's take a look at the Feast of Weeks. You may be surprised to learn that the Feast of Weeks also features a first fruits offering, a wave offering. But unlike the Feast of Unleavened Bread, this first fruits wave offering contains leaven. Yes, every household in Israel was to bring 2 loaves of leavened wheat bread, and we learned in verse 20 that they were for the priest. Well, what do you think about leaven in an offering? If unleavened bread is the bread of affliction that represented the affliction of the people as they journeyed, what would leavened bread suggest? Give it some thought. Verse 17 says, "You shall bring in from your dwelling places 2 loaves of bread for a wave offering made of 2/10 of an ephah." By the way, an ephah is an ancient measurement term. "There shall be a fine flour baked with leaven as first fruits to the Lord." This appointed time has a completely different feel about it. Rather than having the looming sense of affliction and impending doom that clouded the Exodus, this feast represented something that was filled with joy and rejoicing. I've come to believe that leaven is often a good metaphor in the Bible that can represent life and vitality and joy. The timing of the Feast of Weeks is pretty easy, since it is counted from the day of first fruits, which we just nailed down. So we've already done the detail work. Leviticus 23, verses 15 and 16 say, "You shall also count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath, from the day when you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, i.e. first fruits, there shall be 7 complete Sabbaths. You shall count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath. Then you shall present a new grain offering to the Lord." So the nation of Israel was told to count 50 days, starting with first fruits, to the day after the 7th Sabbath. And that is the reason this feast is also called Pentecost, because Pentecost is the Greek word for 50th. As I've read the Jewish Talmud over the years, I found it interesting that the rabbis actually seem to use the word Pentecost more than other names when referring to this feast. That's probably the reason that the book of Acts in chapter 2, verse 1, offers no explanation when it says, "When the day of Pentecost had come." It was common knowledge in first century Israel. But let's return to our timeline so we can include this appointed time to the time signature of the Messiah. So from first fruits, which is always on a Sunday, we're going to count 50 days. But let's put it in calendar form to make it easier to visualize. Notice in the upper left, the 17th was the date of the first fruits during the year of the Exodus. That means from Sunday through Saturday would be 7 days, which Leviticus 23 refers to as a complete Sabbath, or 1 week. In the case of the Feast of Weeks, the Israelites were to count 7 complete Sabbaths to the day after the 7th Sabbath, that is 50 days, which is the feast day. Okay, so notice that 50 days takes us through the remainder of the month of Abib, all the way through the month of Iyar, and then to the 6th day of the month of Sivan. So we have to ask ourselves, did a significant event occur on Sivan 6 during the year of the Exodus? Well, the short answer is yes. So let's follow the Israelites' journey in the 19th chapter of Exodus to see what happened. Verse 1 says, "In the 3rd month, after the sons of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that very day they came into the wilderness of Sinai." Okay, the 3rd month means that we've made it to the month of Sivan. So that would be Sivan 1, which is shown on the calendar. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to summarize the events of the first few days after they arrived in the Sinai wilderness. A more thorough description can be found in the chapter 8 of the Messiah book. So in a nutshell, Moses went up and down the mountain a couple times, acting as a go-between between the Lord and the people. The final message from the Lord to Moses was, "Go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their garments, and let them be ready for the third day. For on the third day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people." It looks like something big is about to happen. So what actually happened at Mount Sinai? To abbreviate, Exodus 19, verses 16 to 20 says, "On the third day, when it was morning, there were thunder and lightning flashes, and a thick cloud on the mountain, and a very loud trumpet sound. And Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. And Mount Sinai was all in smoke, because the Lord had descended upon it in fire. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain." The turmoil for the people continued through the next chapter, chapter 20. The Lord introduced his law through the 10 Commandments, which revealed the enormous divide between God's holiness and man's sinfulness. This was not a pleasant introduction to the God of their fathers. When the people heard and saw the thunder and the lightning flashes and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, they trembled. In other words, they were terrified. And they said to Moses, "You speak to us and we will listen, but don't let God speak to us or we will die." Then the Lord said to Moses, "You shall say to Israel, 'You yourselves have seen that I have spoken to you from heaven.'" So what is this account in Exodus telling us? What actually happened at Mount Sinai? To summarize, God reached down to man, revealing his power and might, his holiness and his righteousness, and he also revealed the sinfulness of man. The divide between God and man was enormous. There was no way the people could keep even these 10 commandments, and they knew it. They were now bound to a new law, serving a terrifying and powerful God. But for you and me, there is a much brighter message in this account, as these shadows were later explained. The Messiah's fulfillment holds far more hope and joy than we see through the 11 loaves of bread that were offered on this day. Something very special is foreshadowed, which we'll see in an upcoming lesson. So we'll add Pentecost, which completes our timeline and reveals the time signature of the Messiah. Take a close look at it. Become familiar with it. These are the spring-appointed times. In the next lesson, you will see some amazing things, how the Gospels make it abundantly clear that Jesus fulfilled these shadows in perfect timing, proving beyond a shadow of doubt that he is the Messiah. I look forward to our upcoming lessons with you as we explore how Jesus fulfilled this time signature, revealing that he is the hope of all mankind. Thank you for being part of this study. I'm Don McCluskey, and it's been a joy to bring this information to you.